beach balls. And at the end of the presentation, no? Beach balls. Blow beach balls thrown into the audience.
By the way, this is not in charge of the so many things of this island and what have you. All those are on display in the.
Okay, well, on behalf of WPI, I'm Dominic Golding. I'd like to welcome you to our presentations today. We've got a wonderful set of students presenting 5 different projects that I hope you'll all like. What I'd like to do is just start off with a little bit of background whilst we wait for the audience to assemble. On the Nantucket Project Center. Many of you may know we've been doing projects on Nantucket since 2008. Mike Elms actually started the Project Center then, and I took over in 2009. And since that time, we've done 79 projects with 281 students. And it's a mix of sponsors that we've had on the island. We've done a number of projects with the town, various town officers, as you can see here, about 47 projects, I'm sorry. We've done 21 projects with other non-governmental organizations, some of whom will be here today, represented here today. And then we've done about 11 projects over that time with museums, in particular, obviously, the Nantucket Historical Association, the Whaling Museum, but also the Mariah Mitchell Association. What I'd like to do is really just start off with a note of thanks to all our sponsors. Many of our sponsors are repeat sponsors, so I think we must be doing reasonable work because they keep inviting us back. And we've got, we often have some new sponsors, and I'm always looking for new people that are interested in doing projects. So beyond our sponsors, I'd like to say thank you to the Nantucket Yacht Club for putting our students up. Wonderful facilities, and it's great that we have the location downtown. I'd like to thank Young's Bicycle Shop. Harvey's here in the audience. Jasper's back at the store, I imagine. So I'd certainly like to thank Harvey and Jasper and the Young family for giving us all bicycles to use whilst we're on the island. We have a couple of students, I think we have one student who'd never cycled before, so she learned how to do it. Others have been biking around all over the island, and you've probably seen them out and about in your travels too. I'd like to thank also Remain Nantucket and the Nantucket Historical Association. Remain underwrote the treasure hunt that we had at the beginning of the beginning of our session back in late October, and the Nantucket Historical Association actually put that treasure hunt together, and so that was a very popular thing amongst the students. I'd like to thank the Shipwreck and Life-Saving Museum. They opened up the museum for us. It's obviously ordinarily closed at this time of year, but they gave us a special tour, so I'd like to thank Chuck Arnold for making that possible. Mariah Mitchell also graciously let us join one of their stargazing sessions, and so that was a nice treat for the students also. I'm hoping that next year we may also actually have a project with the Mariah Mitchell Association. The Nantucket Civic League has done what they often do for us, which pushed out one of our surveys so that we could get a few more responses. So I'd like to thank Peter Morrison and Charlie Stott for making that happen. The Nantucket High School. One of the things that's always a problem wherever we go in the world is the students, in spite of the fact that students on Nantucket might be riding around on their bicycles, they always want a gym to go to. And it's a problem depending where we are in the world, but it's very fortunate that when we're in Nantucket, Matt Hunt has made available the gym at the high school. So I think our students appreciate that in particular also. And then finally, I'd like to thank Nantucket Community Television for recording this today. It's going out live. It will also be available after the fact on YouTube. And I'll be sending out a reminder after the presentation with a link to that if anybody wants to watch it after the fact. I'll also be sending out links to the various reports and presentations that will be made available by the students. That's probably going to be by the end of this week, but I'll send out a reminder about how you can access those reports and the presentations. And I guess last but not least, I should thank all the students for all their hard work this term. They've been a great crew to work with. I think they've done an excellent job. We'll see what you think about that shortly. But I think you'll be impressed with what they've done during a fairly short period, 7 weeks that we're on island. And lastly, I'd like to thank my colleague Bruce Burston for being a great co-advisor. It's been fun to work with him, and it's been fun to work with you all. Okay. So I guess without further ado, I will hand it over to the chicken group, if they would like to come forward. So we've got Katie, Trevor, Adam, and Charlie, and they have been sponsored by Posey Constance, who's somewhere back there, Sustainable Nantucket. So over to them. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Katie,
I'm Trevor.
I'm Adam.
And I'm Charlie.
and our project was mobile poultry processing on Nantucket. So a quick summary of our presentation, we'll be going over our project overview, our objectives going into the project, an introduction to mobile poultry processing units or MPPUs, our interviews and what we learned from them, and our recommendations for Sustainable Nantucket.
All right, so we worked with Sustainable Nantucket. They're a nonprofit focused on providing resources for farmers to increase the amount of locally grown food. They have several programs to help them achieve those goals: the Farm to School program, the Mentor Farm program, and Nantucket Grown, and the Farmers Market. So Sustainable Nantucket has recognized a gap in the production and growth of protein on the island. And this is mostly because of the lack of a certified slaughter facility. So the goal of our project was to create a plan and set of materials that Sustainable Nantucket can use for the development and approval of a slaughter facility on the island.
So going into this project, our team had 5 objectives. The first was to identify applicable regulations at federal, state, and local levels. The second was to evaluate lessons learned based on other MPPUs that have been implemented already in other locations similar to Nantucket. Next was to identify the perspectives of the relevant stakeholders, such as farmers and local officials. Then was to determine the MPPU technology and operational guidelines based on our research. And lastly was to develop a set of deliverables for Sustainable Nantucket.
So, what is an MPPU? It's a relatively simple facility. It's just a way to safely and cleanly slaughter chickens. So it starts off with the left side. You can see the slaughter side. That is where the chickens are bled and the feathers are removed. It then moves over to the evisceration side, where the offal is the internal organs are removed and the chicken goes into the chilling process. This is a real-life example of one. This is an early Martha's Vineyard adaptation. Their facility is different now. But on the left, you can see the kill cones and the plucker and the scalding tank, and then the evisceration station.
All right, so why is Sustainable Nantucket looking into using an MPPU? So because there is no slaughter facility on the island, the sale of locally grown chicken is not permitted. So having an MPPU would allow farmers to do that. It's mobile. It allows for flexibility from farmers and Sustainable Nantucket about how they want to use the unit. And it's relatively cost effective. The units we've looked at as examples are charge farmers between $3 and $8 to use the unit per chicken.
So there are three main types of mobile processing units. The first one is an enclosed unit, which is the camper that's depicted here. It has full walls and a ceiling. There's drainage in the floor. The unit is climate controlled and costs around $90,000. The next unit is the open air mounted unit, where the equipment is mounted on an open bed trailer. It leads to a little bit of a cramped workspace. All of the equipment is open to the elements and costs $25,000 to $35,000. The last unit is an enclosed storage open air unit, where the equipment is stored in an enclosed trailer like the one shown, and then taken out and placed on either wood chips or a non-porous surface with drainage for the processing. And it allows for a lot more flexibility in the design of the unit and costs about $25,000.
All right, so we conducted several interviews on the island. We started with farmers. So we interviewed 7 farmers. Of the 7 farmers, 4 of them were interested in using the unit, the MPPU. 4 of them were unsure but would consider it, and 1 said they would not use the unit. So there's 2 main types of chickens that can be grown. Layers, which are better at producing eggs and do not have a lot of meat on them. And broilers, which are a chicken that is mostly grown for meat. And they're fairly fast growing. They can be slaughtered after 7 to 8 weeks. So currently, the farmers we spoke to have about 200 laying chickens, 50 broilers, and 50 ducks. But after the implementation of an MPPU, the farmers were interested in raising up to 600 layers, more than 1,000 broilers, and some would consider turkeys as well. So we interviewed some local officials about these, about things like waste and the regulations we would need to follow. So we spoke to Waste Options about using a digester at the DPW to dispose of some of the waste produced during processing. We spoke to the Nantucket Sewer Department about disposing of wastewater. There's quite a bit of wastewater produced during the slaughtering process. And we also talked to them about the potential for using the wastewater treatment facility on South Shore Road as a potential processing location. Lastly, we spoke to the Nantucket Board of Health about making sure we considered all the regulations that Sustainable Nantucket would need to follow. And lastly, we spoke to several other organizations who have already implemented MPPUs. Martha's Vineyard Agricultural Society currently operates the MPPU on Martha's Vineyard. Island Grown Initiative of Martha's Vineyard was the original organization that started the unit. Both Martha's Vineyard Agricultural Society was gracious enough to let us observe a slaughter event and provided some great resources for us to look into. And New Entry Sustainable Farming Project is a Tufts project who was part of the state pilot program, and they had some great resources that Sustainable Nantucket can use, and that was very useful for our project.
So during our research, we identified some things that Sustainable Nantucket should be looking for their MPPU. One is flexibility. It should be able to process chickens, turkeys, and ducks. Ease of processing, it needs to be easy for people to learn how to use the unit, and it should be very quick to process. Ease of setup and cleanup. This is just to cut down the time. It should be easy to set up the unit, clean it up, put it away. It'll take like 6 hours for the entire processing. Safety, it should be safe, follow all food regulations for safety and physical safety of the people working the unit.
So, based on our research, our team developed a series of recommendations for Sustainable Nantucket on what we believed would be the best options for their future mobile poultry processing unit. So, our recommended type of MPPU was an enclosed trailer with removable equipment. The equipment such as the scalders, the eviscerator, and the plucker would be stored in the trailer and removed and set up for when a processing was to occur. The MPPU having removable equipment makes the equipment protected from the environment, and overall makes it much more flexible in the design of the MPPU itself.
So some of the things that we at Sustainable Nantucket looked into for a slaughter location and had to keep in mind while doing so were we needed level ground with enough space for the equipment, access to water and electricity, and restrooms for the workers. We also had to look into the vicinity of wetlands and biologically active fields, as well as federal, state, and local land restrictions. One example of a location that we recommend Sustainable Nantucket continue exploring is at the wastewater treatment plant that Trevor mentioned. There is an existing 8 by 15 foot cement pad that is surrounded on 3 sides by an office trailer and a building where they have the deer tagging station during hunting season. This would allow access to water and electricity and restroom facilities. Sustainable Nantucket could add to the slide, to the cement pad. As you can see on the slide, they would coat it in epoxy, put drainage around the perimeter to allow the wastewater to be directly transported to the sewer treatment facility, and have a small raised barrier in between to prevent contamination between the slaughter and evisceration sides.
So, for waste disposal, it is a big hurdle we had to tackle, and there's a lot of waste that's generated during the slaughter process. A few of the solid waste things are the wood chips, which are used to absorb any spilled water, and also the feathers and any of the internal organs that aren't sold. All of those things can be transported to the Department of Public Works and be put into the digester, which will then be sold for compost. A lot of the liquid that comes from the scalding tanks and from the ice, or from the chilling tanks, is going to need to be properly disposed of. It can't be released into fields due to certain regulations, but luckily it can easily be put into the wastewater treatment facility. So a few of our operating expenses in the financial model that we came up with. Sustainable Nantucket luckily has a grant that can cover a lot of the capital expenses, and through that, the farmer would have to pay for a few of the recurring costs, mainly being labor and ice and propane. A few of the minor costs like wear and tear are really not that much, especially when you're doing a large amount of chickens per slaughter. So the deliverables that we came up with, we have an HACCP plan. That stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Plan. It is a step-by-step safety guideline that will go through the entire slaughter process and break down where biological or physical contaminants can enter into the food chain. So hopefully with a model that's approved by various regulatory agencies, everyone will stay safe. We also have a model recall plan that's very similar to what big companies like Purdue and Tyson use. For if there is a contaminant in the chicken, it can be easily recalled and no one will eat it. We also came up with an operations manual that will have all the instructions on how to set up, slaughter, and clean up after slaughter. of the whole MPPU. So that is it. Are there any questions?
So for the question and answer, and we actually encourage the audience members to ask our students questions. They're eager to hear what you have to say. If you could, we either have boom mics up here at front if you're sitting up close to these, or if you just raise your hand, I will come do my Phil Donahue thing and bring the microphone to you.
Hi, thank you for that. What's the minimum amount of chickens you'd have to process to set up the one you recommended?
So that's still a question that's being worked out with Sustainable Nantucket. For our pricing models, we estimated around 75 birds per slaughter, but it depends on a few different factors that we're not sure of yet.
It is possible that a couple farmers could do processing on the same day. You would have to do cleaning in between, but that could help lower the cost because you wouldn't have to set up everything every time or separately for two separate farmers. It would lower the number of birds you would need to make it effective, but it would, I don't know, probably about 10 to 15 would be the minimum if you were doing it at the same time as someone else.
Did you get a sense of the difference in cost for Nantucket versus other places?
Yeah, so on Nantucket, with everything included, the price per bird comes out to about $9 per bird, at assuming 75 are processed at one time. Martha's Vineyard charges somewhere between $6 and $8 per bird, depending on the number that you're doing. And some of the places on the mainland charge around $3, but they don't include labor with them, which Sustainable Nantucket, I think, plans to do.
As a follow-up to the question that Brooke asked, when you did your pricing analysis and evaluated the cost of labor here on Nantucket versus other places, would the presence of a licensed farmer who could perform along with the licensed operator reduce the cost of labor and make the cost per bird less?
Yes, it definitely would lower the cost because it could replace a whole person.
Do your recommendations satisfy what would be needed to sell these birds in the supermarket or to restaurants?
Do you want to take that one?
So if it is approved by the various health boards in the state and the federal level, it is feasible that it could be able to be sold in supermarkets. Actually, maybe not supermarkets, but maybe in farm stands and stuff like that.
Other questions about chickens? So one thing that didn't come up, I don't think, but in terms of locally processed chicken of this sort, what does this typically sell for? And I think you got a sense in Martha's Vineyard, for example.
Martha's Vineyard sells for around $10 a pound for chicken, like everything included, like at the store. So a 5-pound bird is going to be about $50, yeah.
So from the point of view of the farmer, there would be a reasonable profit margin in using an MPPU.
That's of course depending on the amount of birds that the farmer has.
Yeah.
And then you have to consider as well the difference between a broiler and a laying bird.
All right. Well, please thank our chicken students again.
Okay, well, thank you to the chicken group, and thank you, Constance, for. I'm Posey. I'm messing up Posey's name each time. I think I called you Constance before, which is a relative of mine, so that's why I'm getting confused. But thank you, Posey and Sustainable Nantucket, for sponsoring that project. It was well, it was certainly an education for our students. It was an education for Bruce and I. And I think they did a marvellous job actually putting some of those data together, and we hope that it will be useful for Sustainable Nantucket going forward. So our next group was working with Brian Lenane and Lindsay Pikus at Nantucket Community School, and they're going to, if they want to make their way up here, they were looking at the provision of adult education on Nantucket. And so Tim, Caroline, Hannah, and Aki will tell us what they discovered. Thank you.
Just ignore the date.
Okay, so our project is evaluating the provision of adult education on Nantucket. My name's Caroline.
My name's Hannah.
I'm Tim. And I'm Aki.
So first, a little overview on our sponsor. Our sponsor is the Nantucket Community School. Their goal is to engage, strengthen, and connect. They are a part of the public school system. And you may or may not know this, but the Music Center that's located at 56 Center Street also shares a building with the adult education coordinators. They have a lot of classes in early childhood, youth programs, and adult education. And our project specifically focuses on the adult education. Our project goal was to recommend how the Nantucket Community School can enhance its adult education program to better meet the needs of the community, whether this is a shift in delivery methods or course offerings. We had 4 main objectives for our project. The first was to identify the trends of adult education in the U.S. as a whole. The second was to assess the lessons learned in communities similar to Nantucket, such as Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. The third was to evaluate the data from the Nantucket Community School, both in the past and in the present. And the fourth was to determine the collaborator preferences on adult education in Nantucket. Our methodology was as followed. We did some background research. We interviewed with other adult education professionals. We surveyed past, current, and prospective NCS students. We interviewed past, current, and prospective NCS students, and we interviewed employers on the island. One of the biggest trends that we found from our research was the shift from enrichment classes to more workforce development classes, such as vocational and trade courses. This was confirmed by our conversation with adult education leaders, as many communities similar to Nantucket are also making that switch.
So our survey had a 3-branch structure, bringing the respondent to a specific set of questions, depending on if they had taken courses at NCS before. If they had not taken courses at NCS before, but indicated that they would be interested in the future, and if they had not taken classes at NCS and for whatever reason are not interested in the future.
So before we get into our survey results, we'll just talk a little bit about how we distributed it. Totally, we received 131 responses. 93 were in the English version, and we had 2 translations. We received 31 responses for our Spanish version and 7 from the Portuguese translation. Our biggest method of delivery was a huge email list from past adult education participants at the Nantucket Community School, asking them to fill it out. We also put links to the survey in the Inquirer and the Mirror, and we attended an ESOL class, which is English for Speakers of Other Languages, where we distributed paper copies of the survey. We also attended a Safe Place Nantucket's event at the high school and took a trip to the dump and the Take It or Leave It. And this is an example of what one of our survey questions looks like.
So as Aki said, in addition to an English version of our survey, we also translated it into Spanish and Portuguese, because those are the 2 most common languages spoken on the island other than English. So for the purposes of this presentation, the graph for the English responses will be in orange, and for the non-English responses will be in blue. So one of the questions we asked was for the past NCS students about their interest in future subjects that are not currently offered by the community school. So the most popular responses we received were foreign language, finance and QuickBooks, and computer skills. And that was for the English version. So for the non-English responses, they were most likely interested in foreign language, English literature and writing, and finance and QuickBooks. So another question we asked was for the past NCS students, what motivated them to take courses at the community school? So the most common responses for the English respondents were to improve their technical skills, to obtain a certification degree, and to help them start a business. And for the non-English responses, it was mostly to improve their language skills, improve their chances of getting a job, and to obtain a certification degree. So we also asked the prospective NCS students, those who have not taken courses at the community school before, what their interest would be in future subjects. And the most popular responses for the English version were finance and QuickBooks, computer skills, and foreign language. So all of the same responses as for the past students, just in a different version. And then for the non-English responses, English literature and writing, foreign language, and computer skills were the most popular. So finally, we asked the prospective NCS students what would motivate them to take a course at the community school. So we only included the graph of the English version here because the responses for the non-English version were virtually identical. So the most popular responses were to improve their technical skills, to obtain a certification degree, and to help them start a business, which were all the same as what the past students wanted as well.
So our interview also had a branch structure. The first group of people that we talked to were the employers on the island. The second group was the leaders in the adult education community, both from Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. The third was teachers at the Nantucket Community School, and the fourth was the students, both current, past, and prospective. This is the first group of people that we interviewed, which was the employers. As you can see, we have a wide range of different employers from a bunch of different job types, from government to hospitality to nursing to trade. And a lot of them all wanted things that would help their own business. For example, the nurses wanted phlebotomy and x-ray tech classes, but they also all agreed on a lot of classes that they would like to have. They all wanted professional level foreign language, which would be an English person learning a foreign language at the professional level, most likely Spanish. And they all also wanted leadership classes, management classes, and finance classes.
And so here is a list of the leaders in adult education that we interviewed. These range from professionals on Nantucket to Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. So one of the specific people we interviewed was Holly Bellobuono, the executive director of MVCET, which is the Martha's Vineyard Center for Education and Training. So Holly's interview really stuck out to us because her responses really echoed trends we've seen in adult education across the United States, as well as here on Nantucket. So basically the MVCET began as an enrichment-focused school, and then in 2015 shifted to more workforce development and vocational training, because that's what the needs of the community showed. And finally, Holly mentioned that NCS and Martha's Vineyard should try to collaborate more due to how similar the communities are geographically.
Then we also spoke to teachers at the NCS. We spoke to Dave Harris, the real estate instructor, John Minton, the GED instructor, and Michelle Saravia, one of the ESOL coordinators. And one of the things that stuck out to us when we were talking to Dave Harris is he just spoke about how easy the NCS makes it for him to come back time and time again to teach his course for a week. The NCS has housing that they provide at the top floor of the same building that Dave actually teaches the class in. So we can get up early, go to the beach, watch the sunrise, come back, get a coffee, and then teach the class. And he's interested in the class, and he's kind of talked about the whole trip as kind of a little vacation, just because about how easy the NCS makes it for him. And we think that could be a great way for the NCS to potentially find new instructors for courses, because finding instructors on island can be very difficult because it's such a small island and a lot of people are busy, so you have to look off island.
The last group of people we spoke to were some of the students of the NCS, and these are more of informal conversations we had. The first group of people we spoke to were Dave Harris's real estate students, and they all said that they just took the class to advance their career and make money. And they all said that they wanted foreign language classes so they could expand their market. We spoke to some of the ESOL classes, students when we attended the class at the high school, and they said that they appreciated the leveling structure that the NCS has. The NCS offers 4 skill levels for English to speakers of other languages, so they can be grouped with other people of similar abilities, and they said that they appreciated that because they didn't feel too overwhelmed when learning something new. We spoke with Chang Ying Sun, who is a local sushi business owner, and he was a former driver's ed student with the NCS, and he's now interested in taking more classes to improve his business specifically. And he mentioned English classes for himself and any other business management courses should they be offered.
So the interview findings aligned pretty well with the survey findings. People wanted finance classes, they wanted computer skills classes, they wanted foreign language classes, but they also wanted healthcare, management, and vocational and trade courses. The most important takeaway from the interviews was how important it was to train people on the island. Right now, a lot of employers are looking off island to hire people, and it's really hard to get these people to stay on island after the fact because they're not from here, and so they're not used to it. So being able to grow people here and train people on island is very important.
Now we're going to talk about our conclusions and recommendations. So this slide is just a sneak peek of what we're going to go more in depth with in the next few slides. Certifications are definitely getting more important. We're going to talk about popular subjects desired, and then go in depth more with the CPR ESOL courses, as well as GED and real estate, and then also talk about healthcare and trade vocational courses. So our first recommendation is we recommend the NCS add courses in finance and QuickBooks, technology, computer skills, and foreign languages, professional level to be specific. So finance and QuickBooks were big with the nonprofits we spoke with just so they could learn how to run their business better, get more in depth with their money, and do it all in-house. Computer skills and technology skills were consistently asked for by people we talked to, whether it just be intro courses for just a computer or an iPhone, or whether it be more in-depth courses such as Microsoft Office products or Zoom products, just depending on who we asked. And then also professional foreign languages. One specific we thought of was the hospital, for the nurses to learn professional medical Spanish so they communicate more effectively with their patients for who English may not be the first language. Recommendation 2 is we recommend the NCS have more courses that have a certification at the end of it, because certifications are getting a lot bigger in the world we're in today, as it's something tangible someone can have in a job interview, put on an application, and it makes them a more appealable applicant to potential employers and just helps with their career. And our recommendation 3 is we recommend the NCS continue to offer CPR and first aid courses and ESOL courses, as those consistently had the highest enrollment numbers at the school, and as well as real estate and GED courses consistently were reaching capacity. And we don't want to change what's not broken.
So our fourth recommendation, in keeping what Tim said about not changing what isn't broken, as we talked about before, the ESOL students enjoyed the skill leveling that the course offered, and we recommend that the NCS break other courses into different skill levels, if applicable. For example, we talked about how people want technology courses, which is such a huge field that can be anything from setting up an iPhone to making a PowerPoint presentation like this. So breaking it into different skill levels will allow people to not feel overwhelmed when trying to learn something new. Our fifth recommendation for the NCS would be that they continue to build upon their marketing methods. Some of the people we spoke to said that they were interested in certain adult education opportunities, but were just unaware that it was offered within their community by the NCS. So by attending more events with hard-to-reach groups and just getting the name out there and the information that the NCS offers certain programs, they'll be able to gain more students. Our final recommendation would be that the NCS has a course evaluation system so that students can provide anonymous feedback at the end of every course, just to facilitate continuous improvement year over year of offerings and delivery methods based on what worked and what didn't. There are some challenges that the NCS will continue to face, and the biggest one is finding and keeping instructors. It's difficult to find skilled people with the time to teach, especially here on Nantucket, which will often give them the need to recruit off-island. And then the second challenge with that is finding people housing to stay here as when they do teach the courses. We talked about Dave Harris, but unfortunately the NCS only has one bedroom in their building right now. So it's not exactly ideal when they're trying to run more classes. And marketing, again, certain hard-to-reach groups, like certain cultural groups who are not as much in the mainstream, may not hear about these opportunities from the NCS as much. And also certain tradespeople will be too busy even to teach courses. So targeting those groups is still going to be a challenge. And finally, defining specific curricula for certain courses. We talked about finance and technology, and these are such broad fields that can encompass anything from personal finance to corporate finance. And really honing in on what each course should focus on is going to be something that still needs to be looked into. So thank you all for listening to our presentation. Here are some acknowledgments that we have. Thank you to everyone who helped make this project possible. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Questions for our education students?
Thank you. Yeah, quick question. Was there any discussion or information gathered on testing or expanding testing or proctoring? Because I took the real estate class myself, but I had to go off island for testing. So it'd be kind of nice to keep it on island, because it took me, I don't know, a couple months after I took the class to schedule the test as well.
Well, I think the certain test centers are administered by the Board of Realtors, like the Massachusetts state government. So for them to create a test center on Nantucket, that would have to go through them. I'm not quite sure the process of that, but that is, yeah, that's something determined by the state, unfortunately. They have their certain test centers.
So we are expanding our test center capabilities at the community school, and hopefully we will be having the real estate licensure exam offered there. The problem is as Aki pointed out, the testing capabilities go to the highest bidder in the state, and so it depends upon which one of the proprietary test centers wins those particular tests to administer. So yeah, we will be able to bring one, but we'll still miss on others, right? We won't have all of the nursing certification here. I do have a question for the team. I really liked your methodology. Do you believe that that methodology that you developed and used in this program could be applied to other nonprofits?
Yeah, I think you could definitely use, like, we went to a lot of different places. We just spent a lot of time trying to get the survey out there and trying to meet people. And so I think just spending as much time as you can, like, on the ground trying to get your survey out is the way that would work for any survey.
And I also would like to point out that we received all this information just in the 4 or 5 weeks that we had our survey out there. So given a bigger time frame, I'm sure there's much more that could be done as well.
Do you know which outreach method brought the most English as a second language respondents?
Going to the class and having everyone fill out the paper survey at the ESOL class definitely brought in the majority of those responses.
First, thank you. In terms of, with the shortness of the structures and stuff, is there any partnerships or collaborations in terms of maybe working with Martha's Vineyard or the Cape in terms of online courses that would be able to, was that, at least explored or discovered or taken off the table because of impracticality or anything?
Yeah, we know that the NCS is working to continue to offer more courses to be available online, especially hastened since the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I know that the real estate class is one that can be taken online, and they're looking to expand that further as well.
Communities like Martha's Vineyard also reached out and said that they would be willing to partner with us and work with us to do other classes.
This team's had to absorb a lot of questions from Dominic and me, so I'm going to give you one more. And it's on the housing front. So do you have a sense, so if you're going to come up with some way to have housing, probably something in the dead of winter would be the most feasible time to get reasonable rental properties. Do you have any sense of whether or not there would be demand for such courses year-round?
That is something that was not within the scope of our survey. We more focused on what kinds of topics people would be interested in. I'm sure more information could be gathered on when, the seasonality, I guess, of these requests. That is a good question.
If there are no other questions, let's thank this team again. Oh, you have another question?
Yeah, we work together, but he's always trying to cut me off. Just for a bit of local colour, I want to hear Aki's experience in going to the dump.
It was really windy. Tim and Caroline were sick. So me and Hannah had to bike. Thank you very much for the bikes. But 3.5 miles out to the Nantucket Mall in 30-mile-an-hour winds on a Sunday morning, because, as Brian said, that's where all the people are. So we took our flyers, we put our hats on, and we biked out there. It took way longer than it should have. I mean, I was in first gear, and a gust of wind would literally stop me dead in my tracks on the bike. It was, yeah. And then I get there, we talked to everyone. Most people were interested in throwing away their garbage. And then a fish hook got in my tire. And I called Young's, and they couldn't come pick me up because there was only one person in the store that day because it was a Sunday. Luckily, Cole's father was here visiting on the island that day, and he happened to have rented a Jeep. And he actually saw us leaving for the dump, and said, if you need a rescue, let us know. So I hold to this day that he jinxed me.
And we
got like one
yeah.
response.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we got like one response.
Yeah, that was the worst part. There wasn't much that came out of it.
But
So yeah, just an example of the trials and tribulations of doing research, whether it's on Nantucket or elsewhere.
And as Dominic said, it could have been worse. It could have been raining.
I tell the story, but they don't believe me, of a team we had a few years ago. It was a team of 3 women who were working with the DPW looking at an assessment of roads on Nantucket. And I think they biked all 300 miles of roads, as you know, 200 miles of which are dirt road, in all sorts of weather. So Aki's got a way to go yet, but he's got a good story to tell going forward. I did want to give Posey, Lindsay and Brian a chance because to say if anything else that they'd like to in terms of the experience of working with students, because I know this is the first time they've worked with a team. So it's a bit of self-promotion on WPI's part, but I don't know if Posey or Brian or Lindsay would like to say anything about the experience.
Don't feel on the spot at all. I couldn't thank my team, my chicken team, enough for their engineering question capabilities. They asked tough questions, good questions, the right questions, and then synthesized all of it in a way that I might need to have one of those Who Wants to Be a Millionaire lifelines, so that when I'm trying to do the ordering for all the links they provided for everything I'm going to need to buy, and the conversations had with town officials, which I'll need to go back and go, I need that memory lifeline on what the heck they said and how we were going to approach that. Anyway, my team was awesome, as I'm sure all the other teams were for their sponsors. But I can't wait to come up with another project for WPI. And I wish you, all you students, really well on your journeys. And thank you for spending your time on Nantucket.
Thank you, Posey. Posey was a great sponsor too. She, I think, drove our students around a lot of the places and even flew them over to Martha's Vineyard, which was a real treat. So, so thank you to Sustainable Nantucket and Posey for doing that. Brian.
Our team was fabulous. The thing that I've worked with many groups in my career, and the thing that I was most impressed about was the professionalism in which our team approached their work. And then beyond that, we just had a heck of a lot of fun, which makes the work go a little bit better. And beyond that, I think the methodology here is really important because I will tell you that Lindsay and I have struggled mightily to get responses to surveys, and I've sent them out year after year after year. And in 5 weeks, they get more than 100 responses. That is awesome. We've never gotten anywhere near that kind of response rate in order to have some data to make some meaningful recommendations. And so we're very grateful because not only were they helpful to us, I learned a lot and just really enjoyed the experience.
I will just add, the adult education department is just one department of the community school. And I do hope that in the future we have an opportunity to work with another WPI group with another department, because you guys did a really great job. Thank you for all your hard work.
All right, let's thank this group, and I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Okay, so moving on. Change of topic. The next team was working with Niles Parker, who's here today, and Ed Rudd at the Whaling Museum, the Nantucket Historical Association. And they were using a particular kind of software called story mapping that's actually part of ArcGIS. They'll tell us about that. But they were looking at using story mapping looking at floods and flood protection at the Whaling Museum. And we have Dan, Jeremy, John, and Samantha, who will tell us more about their project. Thank you.
So, hello, my name's Daniel.
I'm Jeremy.
I'm John.
I'm Samantha.
So our project was story mapping sea level rise for the Nantucket Whaling Museum.
The goal of our project was to create a story map for the NHA to present the history of the Whaling Museum and the effects that flooding and sea level rise have on the complex now and in the future. To complete this goal, we used ArcGIS story maps, a tool used to tell stories of around the world using maps that provide a sequence of animated elements as you scroll. The maps are highly customizable, which allows creativity and personalization.
So one of the challenges we faced was actually wrapping our heads around the idea of sea level rise and what that means for the museum. It's by no means a simple topic, and not only figuring out for ourselves what it is, but also trying to explain it to a lay audience was a difficult task. So a couple key terms are mean sea level and mean high or high water. Mean sea level, kind of self-explanatory, just the average water height, and it varies location to location globally. The one that tends to give people a little bit of trouble is mean high or high water. Bruce knows. And so you can see in this graph, which is taken from NOAA, it just is a tide projection graph. The orange line represents mean sea level, which is our 0 in this case, and the blue line represents the change in tides. So during each tidal day, there are 2 high tides, and mean high or high water is the average of the higher of those, as seen by the 3 arrows, over a 19-year period known as the National Tidal Datum Epoch. And the reason mean high or high water is so important for sea level rise and flooding is because it shows the highest point that water will regularly reach, and anything above that would be considered inundation and flooding.
The most recent NOAA projections came out in 2022 that show the future of sea level rise with 0 in 2005. The graph shows multiple scenarios ranging from intermediate low at 2.5 feet of rise to the high scenario at more than 6.5 feet of rise by the end of the century.
So before those projections came out, NOAA came out with a separate set in 2017, shown here with the 2022 ones. A key thing to note is that the new projections now accept 0.43 feet of rise since the year 2000, which was projected by the intermediate low scenario in 2017. While this is not guaranteed to be the correct scenario to track looking forward, it is currently most likely, while also not knowing enough about which CO2 emission scenario we are in. The new projections are also in 20-year intervals rather than 10, and they do not have an extreme or low scenario on the chart.
Data for water levels and sea level rise projections on Nantucket are collected by the NOAA Tide Station, located on the right side of the screen. The Whaling Museum, located at the top left of the screen, is only a couple hundred yards away. This makes the data very accurate for projections and useful in relation to the museum. Also highlighted is Easy Street, which is a prime example of flooding in the downtown area due to its frequency of flooding caused by its low elevation and proximity to the water.
So as sea level rise continues, so will the frequency of flooding. This graph, taken from a presentation done by Chuck Larson about flooding on Easy Street, shows the number of days per year where water levels exceeded 1.8 feet mean high or high water. This would equate to about 6 inches of water at the corner of Easy at Oak Street, and at that height it becomes unsafe for travel of vehicles. The table to the right shows that during the 80s, this would happen about once a decade, and it is projected that by the year 2040, this is supposed to happen every few days. Here you can see what flooding on Easy Street looks like from a rendering done by the University of Florida. This shows about 1 to 2 feet of water on Easy Street, which would equate to about 2 feet of sea level rise, this being mean high water, which the intermediate high scenario from the 2022 projections predicts to be by the year 2060. And here you can see 3 to 4 feet of water on Easy Street, which would be about 5 feet of sea level rise, and that being mean high water. And you can see just how close it gets up to the Whaling Museum, even past it a little bit. And based on the 2022 projections, this is expected from the intermediate high scenario to happen by the year 2100. So basically, by the year 2100, the Whaling Museum is going to be a beachfront property.
Now, a focus on the Whaling Museum were words to live by this semester for us because they define the overall scope of our project and the lens that we wanted the NHA's audience to see this complex issue through. As such, our project called for a detailed study on the museum itself and a deep familiarity with the singular block on which it stands, and as an added stipulation that we tuned all data and information that we used to the museum's unique situation and needs. Now, in the course of learning about the museum, resources such as the NHA's own detailed archives, historic Sanborn fire insurance maps, and records in the museum itself and the planning office, including detailed schematics of the museum over the past decades, came in very useful when building a strong historical context on the museum and the changes it's been through, effectively giving us a vantage point on its state from 1869, which saw the fall of the whaling industry and the closure of the Hadwin and Barney oil and candle factory through today. Now, this factory has been integral to the entire complex, its entire lifespan, on account of being where the museum originally started, and therefore we used it to anchor our studies. And the archives provided a wealth of information on it, including interior shots like these showing the wealth of artifacts that it has displayed over its lifespan, as well as exterior shots showing how, despite its original character being preserved, it still has changed over the course of a century or so. And that brings us to today, where the factory is now part of a sizable complex as opposed to a standalone building. It remains a focal point for understanding the building's history, as you'd expect, but also for understanding how flooding is going to impact it, because due to its old age and its low elevation, it is sort of the weak link that is most jeopardized by the effects of a rising sea.
Culminating all of the history, climate, and flood mitigation research we've done on and off the island, we created an interactive story map using the ArcGIS story map software. Our story map is broken down into 4 sections. We present the history of the museum in a stylistic manner, then sea level rise projections in the looking forward section. Next, we go over the hazards the Whaling Museum is currently facing, and then followed by potential mitigation strategies the NHA could implement in the future.
Now, beginning with our history section, we present a sequence of AutoCAD schematics that we drew up from the aforementioned historical reference and schematics that we found in the museum and by consulting with the HDC and planning office. And these are shown alongside text and images depicting roughly 175 years of change on this block, which we conveniently boiled down into roughly 5 phases of construction. This begins with the museum's, or rather the factory's, initial state before acquisition by the NHA, circa 1969 onwards, followed by its acquisition by the NHA in 1929 and subsequent opening as the museum in 30. Then we jump ahead to the construction of the Peter Folger Museum, as well as a connecting annex that began to knit together the complex as it exists today. Then the construction of the building is now the Discovery Center, but at the time was the museum's original gift shop in 1985. And then the present day, which was after some construction that completed in 2005, you now have Gosnell Hall, where the famous sperm whale skeleton is hung from the ceiling, as well as the roof deck. And this schematic, especially in reference to the earlier ones, drives home an important point for those who are interested in resilience. The block itself remains effectively unrecognizable to what it used to be, and as such, one needs to grasp the fact that gradual change to even a historic site like this is inevitable and not something to be feared. Flood prevention could be considered just another stepping stone in this sort of sequence that we're building, and one that's very important for ensuring the building's longevity.
Using a slider element and story maps, the difference between the candle factory when it opened as a museum 91 years ago versus today. After the history section, we move into the looking forward section. There we take an in-depth look at sea level rise and how it could affect the museum in the future. We present the information using a slideshow and story maps that has an image on the right with text on the left that change as the user scrolls down the page. We also included a Learn More button that links to our resources section, allowing the user to explore a topic more. The goal of this section is not only to inspire education about history and climate science, but also to get across the fact that water is coming.
Because of the museum's location, it's vulnerable to structural and road flooding. As you can see on the photo on the left, the entire area is surrounded by floodwater. The next photo shows erosion damage to the foundation of the Discovery Center. Then wind and debris damage is shown with the fallen leaves and branches at the back of the Discovery Center. The final photo shows the walls breaking off the floor in the basement of the candle factory. Because of these recurring flooding issues, the team created a schematic and identified locations within the complex that were most frequently affected by flooding. For example, number 5 on the schematic represents the north elevation doors of the candle factory, which experienced so much flooding that temporary protective sandbags have now become a permanent fixture. These photos depict the current mitigation measures the NHA employees use when dealing with flooding. Currently, wet vacs, flood sacks, sandbags, and drop-in barriers are all used within the candle factory. The NHA is also working on implementing suggestions from a 2018 vulnerability report. This includes a new shed roof installation, dry-proofing the candle factory's floor, and reconnecting the storm water drains to the downspouts. As part of our research into potential mitigation strategies, there are several paths the NHA may consider investigating, all of which were drawn from the standards outlined by the National Park Service. We also organized these strategies into 3 timeframes: short, medium, and long-term, all of which follow the interval used by the Coastal Resilience Plan. Because most present-day flooding results from storm events, the short-term strategies seen here will continue to be effective into the foreseeable future. Most can be quickly deployed with minimal manpower and are very cost-effective. The NHA might consider investigating the feasibility of medium-term solutions closer to the start of this interval. The island may begin experiencing stronger effects of climate change with more intense storm and flooding events. While the short-term options are still viable, many of the medium-term suggestions may be contemplated as the exterior of the Whaling Museum become more threatened. Mitigation measures at this level are of moderate cost but may be eligible for grant funding. The potential resiliency options shown within this time interval are much more radical. They are also the most expensive of today's available options. While there is hope that sea level rise projections can improve, the sad reality is that the effects of climate change could be devastating beyond the year of 2100.
So we just like to give a thank you to the Nantucket Historical Association, specifically Niles Parker, Ed Rudd, Mary Novissimo, and the staff of the Whaling Museum and Research Library, as well as Vince Murphy, Holly Backus, Peter Morrison, and of course our advisors, Bruce Burston and Dominic Golding. Thank you.
Questions for our story map team? Questions for our story map team?
Is there anything we can learn from European countries in terms of places like Venice or Netherlands and stuff, in terms of they seem to have been dealing with water infiltration and done it maybe a little more successfully than we are in this country? So any suggestions from that perspective?
Well, we have looked at some case studies from other locations. Some of the main measures we came up with was just following wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing. Every location, you can implement different solutions, but you also have to follow the rules in place.
And it's worth noting a lot of foresight is needed for a lot of these things as well. And I want to try to remember. I believe was it Venice or another site that was dealing with a large amount of flooding, and had installed electronic barriers that could be deployed in severe flooding events. But due to a lack of foresight, do you happen to recall? Do you remember the case study?
Might have been the Netherlands. Was it the Netherlands?
Yeah, I think it may have been the Netherlands case. Due to a lack of foresight, they just haven't been deploying properly, and ultimately it ended up being an incredibly costly endeavor that made very little difference to the surrounding area. And that's why these sorts of things need to sort of be talked through with a lot of neighbors and what have you, especially because any kind of dry floodproofing guideline, the water that would be entering your building would instead need to enter somewhere else. And so the more collaboration you can have between neighbors, making sure that everyone is protected, the better. And wherever you're sourcing, sort of solutions from, that always needs to be kept in mind.
Other questions? Anybody nervous about the fact that water is coming?
I just wanted to thank you all for this work that you've done. And also, I got to watch you with the National Park Service while they were here this past week. And I just wanted to ask what kind of experience that was. Just curious.
Yeah, it was a really cool experience. Part of this project being about something that could have so much effect on the island. It's cool to be part of the first steps of that process, as long as having the opportunity to be in a room of people that actually know what they're talking about. Not that we don't. But having that opportunity was definitely something we're grateful for. And again, thank you to Niles for letting us do that.
Well, thank you very much. I just reiterate what was said earlier. I think your team was fantastic. You were very professional. You rolled with the punches when we kind of moderated things a little bit early on and shifted some priorities around a little bit, and you responded right away. Your work's been fantastic throughout and leading, well, right up to today. But I thought your introduction that set the stage for the Park Service last week was great, and I know well received. This project's critically important to us as we start to wrestle with this issue. And as John said, we don't want to do it alone. We want to work with the town and their neighbors and use this as a resource that we can share with others. But to that end, the fact that we now have these resources in one place, the work you've done to sort of consolidate these various resources which are scattered around, is so valuable to us, and we very much appreciate it. To have this story map is going to be fantastic. One of the things that's coming out of the Park Service symposium from last week is that we're going to have at least one and likely a few people who are here working with us to do a series of historic structure reports for our properties on the island, and we're going to be starting with the Candle Factory in the Whaling Museum. And they saw what you've been working on, and they said, well, that's the exact model that we should be using when we start working on some of these HSRs. And so the fact that we now have that, and you've helped us to create that and be ready for it ahead of time, is a tremendous leg up for us. So I'm very, very grateful. Thanks for your hard work this semester.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So you had a chance to talk to a lot of people, do a lot of research. From the island's perspective, what do you see as the biggest barriers to implementing? These are big changes. This is a historical place, and so did you get a sense of what some of the bigger barriers that people wanting to address this would have to really focus on to make good things happen?
One of the primary concerns is kind of maintaining the island, the local character of keeping Nantucket, and having big changes are probably not going to be implemented very easily. So we have to keep the history and the context of the character in mind.
It's also just Nantucket being where it is and completely surrounded by water. There's not really much else place for it to go. So, you know, you don't want to run away from it, but then again, you also really need to deal with it. And so certain strategies really need to be started planning now, honestly, so that for the future, it won't be as severe and not as drastic, or at least not feel as drastic of a change.
Any additional questions? If not, let's thank this team one more time.
Okay, thank you. So our fourth project report today is looking at the integrating solar into Nantucket's historic fabric. And Casey, Sean, Morgan, and Ben conducted this project and will report on it today. They were working with Holly Backus. For those of you who don't know Holly, who was just standing a minute ago with a question, is the preservation planner here. They were working with Mary Bergman from the Nantucket Preservation Trust and Lauren Sinatra in the Nantucket Energy Office. So over to them. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, you're holding the one that looks like it's meant to be held in your hand.
All right, so we are the solar team. I'm Morgan.
I'm Sean.
I'm Ben.
So Ben.
So the goal of our project was really to develop recommendations and resources that the town of Nantucket. Oh, yep. Okay. Sorry. So the goal of our project was really to develop recommendations and resources that the town of Nantucket, in collaboration with the Nantucket Preservation Trust, can use to encourage and assist in the permitting of solar technologies without compromising the island's historic and architectural character. So Nantucket residents find themselves with a unique set of circumstances that motivate the installation of solar. The island has notably high energy costs due to the isolated location and is primarily dependent on the two undersea cables for electricity. Solar installations offer a way to lower recurrent energy costs and decrease dependence on mainland electrical generation. And thirdly, Nantucket is aware of the unique vulnerability of the island to the changing climate, and all of these really work together to motivate the adoption of solar for the electrical generation needs of the island.
So the graph behind me shows a relatively steady increase in peak demand for electricity on the island. As mentioned before, their main source are two cables, one with a 36 megawatt capacity and the other with a 38 megawatt. So for reference with these numbers, 74 megawatts is the max before Nantucket will have power issues. And there's a unprecedented 8.3% increase in demand this past year.
As a result of the aforementioned factors, solar has seen a steady, almost precipitous rise in annual new installations over the past decade. Although rates have stabilized somewhat in the past few years after a particularly notable jump between 2019 and 2020. As of late 2022, there are around 200 solar installations total on Nantucket. And according to data from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, the total capacity of all these installations is about 1.9 megawatts together.
So to gather information for our report, we identified three main objectives. The first was to analyze other historic districts in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and compare their guidelines with Nantucket's. After that, we identified stakeholders and key informants for our based on where their area of expertise was. So these included solar installers, residents who have previously applied for solar or for a certificate of appropriateness that was related to a solar installation, as well as representatives from HDCs both on and off island. And third, we developed a community survey that was distributed to the Nantucket Civic League, as well as a list of residents who had solar installed on their property.
So as Morgan just mentioned, the first thing we did was review other historic solar guidelines, and we reviewed 62 other HDCs. 44 were in Massachusetts and 18 in Rhode Island. In the map you see behind me, the 25 red dots were all HDCs, where they have no mention of solar technology throughout their design guidelines. The yellow ones mention it in their external equipment section, which includes skylights and satellite dishes, and all they say is we don't want to see them from the street. And all the green dots are where they have specific solar sections, but they range from being 2 sentences saying, again, we don't want to see them from the road, to 4 pages giving tips and other things. Some of the more unique guidelines we came across were Sudbury and Provincetown, focused on panel orientation and having them all together to give a more uniform look. Arlington included links to articles on how to integrate solar into old buildings. And Providence actually structured their guidelines based on where you were installing them. So they have a section for a flat roof, a sloped roof that you can't see from the road, a sloped roof where you could see it from the road, and a ground mount. Salem by far had the best guidelines. They actually just updated theirs. And they have a section on tips for applicants, as well as a checklist of all the materials the HDC will need to review it effectively. And they also have examples and diagrams, which are shown here on the slide. So we reached out to all of the HDCs in green, and were only able to conduct interviews with Northampton, Sudbury, Salem, and Providence. And they all stated that they created their guidelines due to an increase in demand for solar in their town, and that they were all open to solar shingles. In fact, Sudbury and Providence stated they'd rather see the shingles than panels. And we were also able to create this table based off the interview. And you can see Nantucket has approved over double the amount of solar installations that the next closest, which is Providence, has seen. So to get a better understanding of how the guidelines are implemented and who they affect, we've spoke to the 3 main groups of people on the island that are directly impacted by them. The first being the solar installers. We learned from them that the demand for solar panels has gone up relatively consistently for the last 5 years, and in the last 12 months there was a large jump, and they install 70 to 90% of their installations are roof mounts. They do ground mounts, but they're 15% more expensive, and you need at least an acre of land for them to be effective. They also mentioned that they pre-screen potential clients, so if they know they can't integrate them to meet the guidelines, they'll tell the client there. And they also stated that they'll do 1 revision. If the HGC requests them do one, they will do 1. And after that, it's just not financially sensible for them to keep going back and forth. Next, we spoke to a Nantucket HDC commissioner who told us that solar is an interesting challenge because their job is to maintain the character, but they also don't want to have to put a 3rd cable in, and they also want to see the cost of living on the island come down. They also stated that their current concern with solar roof shingles is that they're too reflective and make the building look almost like it has a metal roof. instead of the cedar or asphalt that Nantucket is known for. They also said that they'd be willing to look at any new technologies that come through, and that they were transitioning from paper applications to digital. We also spoke to a handful of people that went through the application process with installers, and they felt that the current guidelines weren't fair enough. They also surprisingly were unfamiliar with the application process because evidently the installers handle most of it and do almost all of the talking with the HDC. And they all agreed that a checklist and a guide to going solar would be very useful for prospective applicants.
So, as we mentioned before, we distributed a survey to the Nantucket Civic League as well as a list of residents who have solar installed on their property. We received a total of about 208 responses, although some questions had less answers depending on whether a respondent chose to skip the question. Aside from some general demographic questions to start, most of the survey had to do with the respondents' perceptions on the current HDC guidelines, as well as their awareness of solar PV systems on island. So, using the data from the survey, we were able to create a few charts. The one on the left shows the responses to a question regarding current perception on the HDC guidelines, while we also gave them examples of the set guidelines. Additionally, on the right were the responses to a statement regarding that panels should not be visible from public ways outside of the two old historic districts of downtown and Sconset. And as you can see, about 61% said that they disagree with that, and which means that they would think that it would be okay if you could see a solar panel from a public way as long as your property isn't within these areas. Additionally, we created this one on the left, which shows the general sentiment towards whether there should be more solar on Nantucket. As you can see, 69% of respondents strongly agreed, feeling that there should be. Additionally, on the chart on the right is the responses to a question based on the interest in installing solar. And as you can see, only 17% of respondents said that they were not interested in installing solar. Finally, with the numbers, we also had some open-ended questions that yielded more qualitative data. These are just some of the range of responses that we got to a question regarding applicant experience with the HDC during their application process. As you can see, there was quite a range, and from what we could tell, it seems that the experience of a respondent was largely dependent on how active they were in the application process, as well as the details of their project, like visibility from a public way.
So another aspect of our project involved exploring possible improvements to the town's existing interactive solar map. To this end, we identified 3 major opportunities for improvement. Firstly, the Google Maps system that the old map was built on really limits the possible functionality of the map. This also contributed to the fact that the solar map was really isolated from the town's other map-based resources and tools. Lastly, the process for updating this map was entirely manual data entry, resulting in largely inconsistent updates. To solve these problems, we have created a new solar map layer which utilizes ArcGIS instead of Google Maps, and this layer will be available alongside the rest of the town's other GIS resources. We also created a system to allow for partial update automation, decreasing the workload required to keep the map up to date. So the new map layer, as I mentioned earlier, is built on ArcGIS, which allows for greater possibilities for more functionality in the future. It contains all the info that was available on the old solar map with a greatly updated list of solar installations. However, the biggest reason by far for replacing the old solar map is that the new layer can be hosted on the Nantucket GIS site by MapGeo. Not only will this enable the layer to be used alongside and in conjunction with all the other Nantucket GIS resources, but MapGeo also offers a far cleaner and modern user interface, greatly improving the user experience. As far as the update process is concerned, we've developed a relatively simple method that allows for partial automation. First, 3 saved custom Energov searches are run. Energov is the town's record-keeping and permitting system. And the data will then be fed into a Python script, which will be used to cross-reference different permits to identify likely new installations and add them to an output spreadsheet. At this point, manual addition or editing of any data is possible, and the sheet will then be sent to the town's GIS coordinator, who will update the marker layer, the solar map layer, with the new data. This will then be sent to MapGeo so that the updated layer can be displayed on the site, and this should allow for significantly lighter workload and more consistent updates.
So, to encourage and assist in the installation of solar technologies without compromising the island's historic and architectural character, we have developed 4 main recommendations. The first would be to pursue a survey and planning grant from the Massachusetts Historical Commission to fund an independent third-party review of the current HDC guidelines relating to solar. As Sean mentioned before, Salem had recently updated theirs, and they did it through basically the same way, where they used the grant to partially fund the review. The second was that we would recommend that the town continue to transition to a more and more online permitting system, just to reduce the paper requirements that are currently there during the application process. Third, we would recommend a renewed focus on data entry and organization into the Energov system, just to try and avoid any incomplete data entries surrounding applications and installations. Finally, for our 4th recommendation, we recommend that our sponsors collaborate to create educational resources for the Nantucket residents as well as prospective applicants. This would include an online guide to going solar, like the one on screen behind me, which is an example from Framingham, Massachusetts, a solar permitting checklist, which would allow applicants to compare the details of their proposed project with what the HDC will be looking for during the review process. Third would be to compile a slideshow of images or to update the sustainable preservation addendum to show more accurate images of what the HDC has approved, so that Nantucket residents and prospective applicants can see more so what the HDC has been approving. And finally, we would recommend that the solar map continue to be updated, so that way the town of Nantucket can continue to see just how many solar installations are cropping up on island.
All right, so before closing, we'd like to thank our sponsors, as well as Nantucket residents who took the time to speak with us. We'd also like to thank the Nantucket Yacht Club for housing us and Young's Bike Shop for loaning bikes to us. And we would also like to thank our advisors, Dominic Golding and Bruce Burston, for all their help over the past 7 weeks.
And
so, any questions?
Thank you.
Questions for the solar group?
Excuse me. Was there any projections done for the energy usage for the island for the next 5 or 10 years upcoming? Because it kind of looks like the trajectory we're on, we're going to hit that 70-something number probably the next 5 years with the amount of building that's going on here.
Probably want to go back to that slide.
Let's see. Can we get back
It's
to
like
that
way
slide?
at the beginning.
Yeah, and I remember where it is.
It's the one with the, yeah. Oh, there. Oh, nope. You went one over. There you go.
we didn't really look at that type of data. We were more so looking at the past trends, but I am sure that it exists. If we had gotten that, or if we had asked for that data from our Lauren Sinatra, from the energy coordinator, I'm sure we could have made that, but unfortunately, that was one that slipped our mind. But it is looking like it's increasing quite rapidly.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your question, it's so as of the most recent data, the peak demand was at 55 megawatts, and the limit of the undersea cables is 74. And we noted that there was the particular spike in the last 2 years where it's starting to increase at a faster rate than it previously was. So yes, there's absolutely a case relatively soon where that limit will be hit.
I could elaborate, Lauren Sinatra, Energy Coordinator. So those types of forecasts are conducted by National Grid, and the most recent example I saw was as of a few years ago, which justified their investment, $80 million for the Tesla backup battery, which is located near the airport. It's 6 megawatt, 48 megawatt hours. But I will just note that Nantucket's peak load occurs in the summertime. Usually the first week of August coincides with Pop Weekend. Earlier than what we see on the mainland, so typically starts around 4 o'clock. But those also happen to be the prime sunshine hours for Nantucket, so we see a direct correlation with installing more solar on Nantucket and decreasing peak loads. So that is a driving research question for the team, and just the solar question in general, why it matters to Nantucket so uniquely, and can defer to the third cable and the need for it. But I think between the 2 undersea cables, the large backup battery that is installed at the airport, and just the amount of solar we see existing and planned for the future, I think we're in okay shape for the next 20 years or so.
Other questions? Yes.
Combine with the research you did for this, but also your engineers, and you deal with lots of stuff. Any promising solar technologies that, people are concerned about the reflective and the different types. Any promising solar technologies coming down the pike that you think would possibly be able to be added to the list of possible solutions?
I know that especially in the background research portion of it, we looked a lot into, I know there was one company, Sunstyle, who has, unfortunately, they're very reflective, but there's another company based out of Italy named Diaqua, I think is how you pronounce it, and they have a terracotta style one, and if the labels weren't on it, you would think it's just a terracotta tile. It's pretty good, so it's just a matter of it being towards something that looks like a wood shingle or an asphalt shingle. That's what it's going to take to develop. So it exists, but just not in that in the form that Nantucket could use on a wide scale just yet. But
so the response is stay tuned.
Yes.
All right. Anything else? Well, it's nice that the sun shines, and the sun is shining today on the solar team. So let's thank them one more time. And actually, before we do, Lauren, I don't know if you wanted to talk. Sorry.
I think both Lauren and I are extremely happy mutually on the work that you all did, specifically on showing the data. The data was the biggest part to really show what the town of Nantucket through the HCC has approved, what's been installed because of the rebate program. So to be able to have that available through our GIS, thank you for working on that Great work. Thanks, guys.
And I echo that too. Great work, team. You've left us with a lot of tools and resources and guidance on how to improve and encourage solar going forward in line with the historic aesthetics and appropriateness for the island. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, we have a team that were looking at the problem of loading and unloading trucks in the downtown area in particular. So David, Cole, Alan, and Mike, if you want to take your spot. And Patrick Reed, who's with us today, is the new transportation planner that many of you may know. This is his first time working with a team, so we'll get some comments from him later, but otherwise we'll hand it straight over to the team. Thank you.
Hi everyone, we are the Trucks Group, and our project is focused on improving truck loading and unloading in downtown Nantucket. I'm Mike.
I'm Cole.
I'm Alan. I'm David.
Now, as an island, Nantucket relies heavily on off-island freight, which is delivered by trucks that come on the ferry. This means that throughout the day, Nantucket receives clusters of trucks that have to drive through downtown along the truck route to get to the rest of the island. Additionally, many trucks deliver in downtown. If you look at the map, you can see all of the restaurants and stores located in this section of Nantucket, and you'll notice they are very heavily concentrated in Nantucket's downtown core, which gives this area a very high demand for freight. This demand peaks during the summer along with tourism, and as I'm sure you all know, this can lead to significant traffic congestion in downtown. Our goal was to analyze the effects that truck unloading has on this congestion and propose strategies to address them.
Yeah, so throughout this project, the majority of the data that we collected was through in-person and virtual interviews, our business survey, and through on-site research. While this data should translate throughout the different seasons, the shoulder season, summer season, etc., the data that was collected was based on the availability of individuals and based on the data that we observed in the traffic patterns during the winter months. After conducting this research, we learned that in 2021, there was an average of 68 trucks per day that would come to Nantucket and a peak of 88 trucks around the 4th of July. With this data, we found that in 2021, freight demand peaked in July for Nantucket. The trucks that came to Nantucket did one of three things, or they still do. One group makes direct deliveries outside of downtown and are not much of an impact of the downtown, as they spend most of their time delivering either to businesses or residents outside of downtown, and they wait for the ferry. Another group goes directly to a distribution center and has some trucks that bring goods to the residents and businesses downtown. And the last group makes direct deliveries in downtown and has a large impact on the amount of trucks in the downtown area. The trucks that either go to a distribution center or deliver outside of downtown follow the truck route that's in yellow. That's laid out by the town as the fastest and easiest method for leaving the core area. Cool. Currently, the town of Nantucket gives truck drivers 11 different loading zones to park and unload goods. Only one of these loading zones is a 24-hour zone, and the rest of them are loading zones for part of the day, the majority of which start at 8 in the morning and go until 12 p.m. or 4 p.m. After speaking with businesses downtown, most deliveries occur between 9 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., and almost all trucks are finished delivering by 5:30 p.m. With this in mind, it makes sense that there are more active loading zones before 12 p.m. Based on our business questionnaire with 49 total responses, trucks park on the street about 50% of the time and park in a nearby loading zone 31% of the time. Otherwise, trucks park behind the business or in company parking. As long as they don't stay for longer than 15 minutes and do not block the flow of traffic, trucks can legally park on the street. This picture shows both legal and illegal parking on the street, where one truck is parked against a curb, allowing traffic to still flow, and another truck is parked in a narrow street, preventing any car from entering or exiting the area.
Throughout our investigation of downtown Nantucket, we arrived at 5 main conclusions. For each of these conclusions, we developed a recommendation, and we hope that by addressing each conclusion, we can substantially improve trucking in downtown. Our first conclusion is that tourists and new truck drivers lack the knowledge required to navigate downtown. Now, as you can see in this map, and likely know from personal experience, there are many one-way streets in downtown, which can be very confusing to navigate your first time seeing them. Additionally, downtown has many signs that people never see outside of Nantucket, and most people aren't used to driving on cobblestone roads. This is made even harder during the summer, when the streets are often crowded and congested. Now, most of the experienced truckers can navigate downtown with minimal issues, but we have found that new ones are more likely to get frustrated when looking for a loading zone and park on the street in a way that can impede traffic or even block the road at some points. Additionally, we have found that while most trucks delivering outtown follow the route without many problems, there have been some rare occasions when trucks miss the left turn onto South Water Street, which causes significant congestion as someone needs to block traffic to allow the trucks to back on the truck route. Tourists don't often block the street, but they are guilty of parking in loading zones, taking them away from trucks, and they often do this unaware that they are parked illegally. And this forces trucks to park on the street as the nearby loading zone is taken up. To address these issues, we recommend the town creates an online parking guide. This guide will have a route out of downtown. Ours currently has the truck route, but other routes could be useful. It will also have loading zones, parking hours, street directions, and accessible parking spots. You can clearly see these in the zoomed-in version of the map. The green boxes are loading zones, and the blue ones are accessible parking spots. The black arrows represent street direction, and the colored lines represent parking areas. The blue lines represent 1 hour parking, and the red lines represent half-hour parking. It is our hope that this guide could reduce the number of tourists who unknowingly park in loading zones, and it could help truck drivers better navigate downtown and find loading zones.
The second conclusion we've come to is that the loading zones downtown aren't always being used to their full capacity. There are some loading zones that exist downtown that have obstacles to their use, which causes drivers to, if they can, avoid using them. Instead, they'll stop in travel lanes or park illegally. To encourage drivers to use the existing loading zones, we recommend that the town consider modifying these loading zones for their ease of use. For example, here on India Street, this loading zone is on a cobblestone road, which makes it difficult for drivers to unload using their hand trucks because of the uneven surface. Instead, drivers will tend to use Independence Lane like we saw before. To encourage the use of the loading zone, we recommend adding the crosswalk here in pink, which will provide a even surface for drivers to unload onto, and also in tandem with the existing loading zone marked in purple, delineate the boundaries of the loading zone so that trucks there won't block the other entrance to Independence Lane. Additionally, we found that even when all the loading zones down are being fully utilized, they can't always meet the demand at peak times. There are some parts of downtown that are underserved by the existing network of loading zones, and other parts that do have access to them, but they don't provide enough capacity, which once again leads to trucks stopping in travel lanes or parking illegally, like these two trucks that have stopped in front of a fire hydrant on Federal Street. Here, we recommend the town consider adding the loading zones marked in blue to improve coverage and add additional capacity. For example, here on Center Street, this loading zone has already been approved by the town, as it would be a short-term loading zone that ends at 12 p.m. to supplement the existing one in green. But this location is currently occupied by a fire hydrant. This could relatively easily be moved to the opposite corner, requiring closing the road on this block for a day and $15,000 paid for by the water company. And because this is a short-term loading zone, it would become an additional 2 to 3 parking spaces for most of the day.
Our fourth conclusion is that the current signage for loading zones in downtown is unclear. With this, we recommend that the town both better defines the boundaries for loading zone 9 and 11 and reevaluates and clarifies the loading zone signs throughout downtown. We first recommend the town looks at reevaluating loading zones 9 on the junction of Main and North Union and 11 on the corner of Main and Orange. The loading zone at 9 currently is very unclear, and the sign that is supposed to show the loading zone is hidden in the back corner and points to an alleyway behind the store. It is our understanding that this sign was moved during the pandemic, but was never really readjusted when the street opened back up. The loading zone at 11 only has one sign that denotes the boundary of the loading zone. While this should not be an issue, as the rest of the street is no parking, since the loading zone is on cobblestone, there is no clear way to know the bounds of the loading zone other than understanding that the crosswalks are the start and end of the zone. From here, we also recommend that the town reevaluates and clarifies the loading zone signs. Currently, most of the loading zones downtown are these combination signs with both the times for when they're a loading zone and when they're the spaces for parking. We found that the combination signs like these often become misinterpreted, and only the word parking is seen before a vehicle parks in the space. For this, we recommend first that the town separates the signs into stacked loading zone and parking signs rather than the current combination signs, similar to the sign post found in front of the Dreamland Theater on South Water Street. This change reduces the instances where a vehicle does not read the full sign before parking, and the sign is much more visible to vehicles without looking out of place downtown. We then believe the town should consider modifying the appearance of the loading zone signs downtown. This doesn't mean changing the colors to match that of the standard signs found outside Nantucket. Rather, smaller changes can be made to those colors that make loading zone signs stand out slightly more and differ from parking spaces, but do not also detract from the overall appearance of downtown. New Bedford, Massachusetts may serve as a useful reference here, where the sign itself preserves the historic colors and shape, but it is much more visible to residents and tourists. While addressing the colors to the loading zone signs, the town could also consider switching to metal signs. This change is cheaper for the DPW, not only to purchase, but to maintain. And as shown by the New Bedford signs, metal signs do not have to look modern. Modifying the appearance of those signs will help tourists better understand the proper signage downtown and reduce the instances when they unknowingly park in loading zones.
For our last conclusion, we have found that the current fines are not sufficient enough to deter illegal parking in loading zones. Currently, the fine for a non-commercial vehicle parking in a loading zone is about $50 in Nantucket. From our interviews, we found that this fine was considered comparable to a fraction of a restaurant meal expense and an accepted cost of doing business. As you can see in the table provided in the slide, cities around the nation have considerably higher fines for parking in a loading zone illegally, with the exception of New Orleans. New Orleans is an outlier because the historic district is not the only community that the fine is set for, so they have to balance the fact that they need to deter tourists from parking in loading zones while remaining equitable for the rest of the population of the city. Through our business questionnaire and interviews, we found that there is considerable support for increasing the fine for illegally parking in a loading zone. So as a result, we recommend that the town of Nantucket consider increasing the fine so that it is similar to the other illegally parking in loading zone fines around the nation. Outside of our 5 main conclusions, we've also developed 4 additional recommendations. First being that the town should designate a liaison to talk to trucking companies. From our interview with Erica Mooney, the operations administrator, it seems like there is a disconnect between the trucking companies and the town administration and the needs that the trucking companies have. As a result, we believe that the town would definitely benefit from having a dedicated liaison for trucking companies. The only communications that Erica Mooney sends out right now is a email to trucking companies notifying them of route changes and road closures. But currently, there are other officials within the town administration and the police department who say they're willing to take a role to be able to be talking to trucking companies. Another recommendation that we have for the town of Nantucket is that they conduct a summer loading zone study. Since we're not here during the peak season, we are not able to witness the amount of activity that the loading zones see during the peak season. So, as a result, the town should consider doing a summer loading zone study and establish benchmarks to determine optimal levels of loading zone use. Some certain areas that they should look at is the frequency of how many times a truck uses a loading zone, and also the amount of times that vehicles are illegally parked in them. Another recommendation that we have is that the town also consider adding some on-street markings for motorists to park their vehicles efficiently. We found that, as you can see in this picture, sometimes motorists do not efficiently use curbside space, and as a result, this leads to sometimes the vehicles encroaching on loading zones, which makes the drivers less likely want to use them. So, the town could consider adding some sort of a pavement marking on the road so that it will help guide the motorists into using curbside space more efficiently. As you can see with the accessible parking space, there's already on pavement markings. So they could consider copying what the accessible parking space is doing, or they could just outline just the corners of each parking space so that the motorists have a guide to park their vehicles and make it less likely for them to encroach on loading zones. Finally, the town should consider revisiting the bylaw considering loading on the side of the street. Currently, there's a misinterpretation that we found that trucks can unload their goods off vehicles for 15 minutes regardless if they're blocking the street. There's two sections in Chapter 375 of the town bylaw where one states that they could park in areas where the signs say that parking is not permitted and unload their goods for 15 minutes. And in the other section, states that vehicles can stand in the middle of travel lanes as long as they don't block traffic. So the town should consider reconciling these two differences in the town bylaw and create no space for gray areas within the two sections by referencing them by having them reference each other. We would like to acknowledge, we would like to thank the following interviewees for taking the time to talk to us and give us their feedback on our project. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Patrick Reed, the Transportation Program Manager, and our sponsors and our advisors, Dominic Golden and Bruce Burston, for guiding us in our project. Are there any questions?
Questions for our truck group?
Thanks a lot. Early on you mentioned about tourists, people who are new to the island, plus also trucks. The common thing they have is they all come over on the ferry. That is there been any talk about using that time that people are stuck on a ferry to instruct them in how to the quirks of Nantucket? Because it's not only just trucking, but I mean the tick population. I mean, there's a lot of things that are unique here that people don't know about until you run into it. Any talk about using that kind of captive time to educate people to regulations and stuff like that?
We didn't discuss specifically reaching to them in that time period, but we did talk to some members of the Steamship Authority, and they said they were open to ideas like posting that guide on their website and stuff and trying to advertise it that way so people coming in would know ahead of time how to navigate downtown. And we also think it could be useful to give that information to car rental companies and have them try to provide that to tourists.
Other questions? Just probably too much excitement about increased parking fines for illegal parking. And on behalf of Dominic and me, I want to thank Patrick.
Oh, most definitely. I'd just like to thank this group. They did an excellent job. The charge that they were given was quite broad. We let them know at the beginning there's a perception that freight is challenging in downtown. That's quite broad, right? And they went ahead and did a great job of engaging all voices, including the trucking community, which I think is often lost in the conversation. I think most of the time people who contact the office are approaching it from their own perspective as a user of the streets. But at the same time, too, we need to engage our freight community as well to make sure their needs are met. And I think some of the recommendations they have in order to make these loading zones more appealing really incentivizes use of the loading zone. So I also think the team did a great job engaging the business community, Steamship Authority, DPW, and police. And I'm particularly appreciative of how practical the solutions that they offered are. And I'm thankful that hopefully we'll be able to kind of continue the conversation and move some of these options forward. So thank you, guys. Nice job.
Okay, thanks, team. I have one last question for you too. So, did I hear that you were offering to come back in the summer to do that summer study? No, huh? Only if Patrick can come up with housing and all the rest of it. Okay, well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Just to wrap up, let me adjust the slides here a minute. If I can. Okay. Oh, that's not what I want. That's what I'm trying to get to. Sorry about that. Just wanted to say thank you to one and all. Thank you for our audience today. Thank you for the audience online. Thank you again to the students and all the sponsors. It's been a great experience on Nantucket, as it always is. It's always a pleasure to come to Nantucket. We do project centers. We do projects at project centers all over the world. We have about 45 different sites that we go to for about 50 odd terms a year, some terms more odd than others. But coming to Nantucket is always an absolute delight. Everybody here is very welcoming, very accommodating to the students, go out of their way to make us welcome and to make these projects happen. So certainly on behalf of WPI, I'd like to thank everyone. I would also like to say, if you've got any project ideas, please do get in touch with me. I'm always happy to entertain them. I'll be back here in May / June at some point to meet with as many people as I can. But you can always reach me at my email address at WPI. I'm always happy to discuss any project ideas that anyone might have. On the screen is our Project Center website and the URL there. We will be posting all of the presentations, slides, and all the actual reports and other deliverables that the teams have put together. Those should be up and available, I hope, by the end of this week. I'm afraid to say that I won't be here next year by all accounts. It sounds like I've done something wrong and they're sending me off to a penal colony. I'm going to Melbourne. So I'm sorry that I won't be joining you all in Nantucket next fall. They haven't yet told me who's coming, but I'm sure they'll send a couple of good advisors along with a whole new set of excellent students. So once again, thanks to one and all for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in the summer, and others will look forward to seeing you in the fall. Thanks again.